Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I am Rachel Weintraub, Executive Director of the Coalition for Sensible Safeguards. We are so appreciative to partner with the Center for Progressive Reform and Public Citizen in hosting this webinar on the Congressional Review Act and how it is likely to be used and weaponized at the beginning of the next Congress and the second Trump administration. CSS is a coalition of over 200 organizations united in the belief that an effective regulatory system is essential to protecting the public interest. CSS is co-chaired by Public Citizen and Consumer Federation of America, and our executive committee includes the AFL-CIO, the Center for Progressive Reform, the Economic Policy Institute, the Natural Resources Defense Council, and the Union of Concerned Scientists. The recent election results have put the CRA back in the spotlight, as President-elect Donald Trump and Republican majorities in both chambers of Congress will have the opportunity to take advantage of the CRA's unique look-back provisions to rescind health, safety, climate, environmental, and financial rules issued late in the Biden administration. We will go over what the look-back provision is, what the timelines are, why we don't know exactly what that is at this moment, all things that I know you are deeply interested in learning about. This webinar will provide an introduction to the CRA, as I said, with a particular focus on how the look-back period works. We will address the controversies surrounding the CRA's potential aggressive use in the next Congress and identify rules that may be targeted for rescission. We will have time for questions and answers at the end of the initial discussion, and we have received your thoughtful questions through the RSVP form, and so we'll get to some of them as well. A few logistical details before we start. This webinar is being recorded, and we will have questions and answers after 3 initial rounds of discussion. Please add questions to the Q&A box, which is on the bottom of your screen, and identify yourself and your organization as you ask the question. I will present your questions that you posted from the Q&A icon to the panelists, as well as the other questions that you have shared with us previously. I am so grateful that our panelists are able to participate in this conversation today, and I'm going to summarize their very impressive bios, and really this is merely a summary of their very impressive careers. Thomas McGarity is the William Powers Jr. and Kim L. Heilbrom Chair in Tort Law, professor at the University of Texas at Austin Law School. Professor McGarity is a leading scholar in the fields of both administrative law and environmental law. He also teaches torts. He has written 7 influential books, including, here's 2 of them, Demolition Agenda, Pollution, Politics, and Power, and Freedom to Harm. His recent articles include Supplemental Environmental Projects and Complex Environmental Litigation, Deregulation Using Stealth Science Strategies with Professor Wendy Wagner, and Deliberative Rulemaking, an empirical study of participation in 3 agency programs. He is a past president of the Center for Progressive Reform. And speaking of Center for Progressive Reform, James Goodwin is the policy director at the Center for Progressive Reform. He joined CPR in May of 2008, and prior to joining CPR, James worked as a legal intern for the Environmental Law Institute and Ecologics Group, Inc. The Center for Progressive Reform is a nonprofit research and advocacy organization that conducts independent scholarly research and policy analysis and advocates for effective collective solutions to our most pressing societal challenges. And Robert Weissman is co-president of Public Citizen, a public interest advocate and activist and expert on corporate and government accountability. He worked as director of the corporate accountability organization Essential Action from 1995 to 2009. From 1989 to 2009, he was editor of the Multinational Monitor, a magazine that tracked multinational corporations. Rob helped make HIV drugs available to the developing world and has provided assistance to numerous governments on intellectual property and access to medicine issues. He previously worked as a public interest attorney at the Center for Study of Responsive Law. Okay, we will now turn to the panel. So we will be doing 3 rounds of questions to each of the panelists, and this first round is focusing on the core founding principles of the Congressional Review Act. So first, to Thomas McGarity. What is the Congressional Review Act? Why was it passed? And why is it relevant?
So the Congressional Review Act is a statute that gives Congress the power to essentially veto regulations promulgated by the executive branch. The legislative veto was an attempt back in the 1970s and throughout the 1980s by Congress to tack on to individual statutes the power to, again, veto those regulations as they were promulgated. But the Supreme Court in the 1980s declared this legislative veto unconstitutional, among other reasons, because it did not require Congress to obtain the signature of the president. So it violated the presentment clause of the United States Constitution. The Congressional Review Act was an attempt during the Gingrich Congress, the 104th Congress, in 1996, to solve that problem by providing for a joint resolution that would be passed by both houses of Congress and signed by the president. A joint resolution is legislation, so it does not violate the presentment clause, and it seemed to be the solution for those in Congress that wanted to have the ability to cancel regulations as they were promulgated. There are, I think, 5 significant aspects to the Congressional Review Act that make it a fairly potent weapon, but only in particular times. First is that, as I mentioned, it requires a president's signature. That being the case, a president is unlikely to sign a joint resolution that overturns or abolishes a rule promulgated by his or her administration. It has happened on one occasion, but that was an occasion in which the agency actually was at the time an independent agency, and so was still not run by the president's party. But that means that for the most part, you're going to see Congressional Review Act joint resolutions get successfully passed at the change of administrations from one party to the other, when the party that prevailed in the recent election also controls both houses of Congress. That's the situation we're in now. It was a situation we were in back in 2001, and it was a situation that we were in at the end of the Obama administration in 2017. So we can expect to see activity because the president will sign joint resolutions passed by a Republican Congress abolishing particular regulations. Another important aspect of it is that there's a 10-day limit on debate, which effectively eliminates the filibuster. So it makes it much easier to pass a joint resolution under the Congressional Review Act than it is to pass legislation generally. Rules subject to a joint resolution are without force and effect. So they are null and void effectively. An important aspect that kind of gets lost in the debates or the concerns about it is that no rule that is significantly the same can be promulgated in the future by the agency without express congressional authorization. So it's a salt the earth provision. Once that rule has been declared without force and effect, there can be no rule
Thank you so much. James, I wanted to ask you, what powers does the CRA actually provide? What shortcuts does it create? And what are the key provisions building on what Professor McGarity said?
Yeah, I mean, what makes the CRA kind of wacky is when you think about it, it doesn't really give Congress any new powers. Congress authorize agencies to issue regulations. It can take that authority away anytime it wants to, right? The problem, as far as Congress is concerned, is Congress has made it very hard to pass legislation. So if it wants to pass a new law, taking regulatory authority away from an agency, it has to go through the very onerous legislative process it's set up for itself. So that's essentially what the CRA does, is it gets Congress out of Congress's own way so it can quickly repeal recently finalized rules. As Professor McGarity mentioned, a couple of those things are it puts a 10-hour limit on debate so that effectively ends or eliminates the filibuster in the Senate, right? That's like the big barrier. Another thing is these resolutions start in committee, in the relevant committee, just like any other bill. And a small minority of the Senate can actually pull these out of committee and put them directly on the Senate floor. So it gives the minority in the Senate a lot of power, and it makes it easy for the minority to set the legislative agenda, and also has provisions on these things don't have to go through committee. It can skip committee, like I said. It also includes a requirement or simplifies how these bills, when they're passed in the two respective chambers, it simplifies the process for bringing them together, so it avoids any problems with aligning those to send them to the president. It basically just takes every little step that could possibly get in the way of Congress of passing these things and eliminates them as much as they can. Like Professor McGarity said, though, the big Achilles heel is that the president has to sign these things, and often a president is not going to be willing to sign legislation repealing his or her own regulation.
Which makes it entirely relevant right now. Rob, building on that, how is the CRA politically asymmetrical?
Thanks, Rachel. So I think in this webinar, we're going to talk a lot about the technical details of how the CRA works, and presumably folks have joined to learn that. I think it's also paramount that we keep in mind the politics of this, because of the process, some things are going to happen, and we're not going to be able to stop some bad things from happening. And it's important that we understand that, but also that we're politically responding to the moment correctly. So this question about the asymmetry speaks to that. The CRA is asymmetrical, to use a big vocabulary word, basically because it's a deregulatory bill. It sets up a deregulatory or pro-deregulatory structure. And it does that in a few ways where it works towards deregulation much more than it could possibly be used for regulation. The first is just what Congress can do. Congress can stop a rule from taking place through the CRA, but it doesn't have the same powers to require a rule to be issued or to give an agency new authority to issue a rule. So, of course, it can do those things legislatively through the regular process, but not in a system where they can avoid the filibuster and move things through in a fast-track way. So Congress's ability under the CRA is just deregulatory, just taking rules off the books. No equal power to put rules on the books or to force agencies to issue rules. That's the first thing. The second thing is the subject of what's being done. Well, they're repealing rules. Now, it is possible for Congress to repeal a deregulatory rule, but you can see the nature of this thing is you're basically repealing rules, you're repealing public protections. That's what we're going to talk about. That's how the CRA has been used in the past. And even if you do use the CRA to repeal a deregulatory rule, which is not the scenario we're facing under the Trump administration, doesn't necessarily mean you revert back to a powerful regulation. You might or you might not. But if you repeal a positive regulation, you've definitely taken it off the books. So it is inherently deregulatory in that way, or tends strongly towards being used for deregulatory purposes in that way. The last thing, which is kind of asymmetrical and just kind of just a weird feature that Tom referenced, and we'll talk about more, is the impact, which is the scope of which is something that's important to work through the details on because it's not so fixed. But the CRA has this thing where if Congress acts to undo a rule, the agency that's affected can't do that same a rule that is substantially the same in the future. That doesn't exist for anything else. So it's sort of an extra layer of deregulation built into this process. So those are the ways it's asymmetrical, and they matter to understand it. But I think the big thing is we should be clear like that. What this is about is this is a legislative process bill, or process legislation act that enables corporations to get what they want at the expense of regular people. And I think it's, as much as we get into the details of stuff, the grand narrative, like we're going to focus on specific narratives when we deal with specific fights in CRA, but the grand narrative connecting them all is super important. This is a way for corporations to get what they want. Agencies have gone through extended process to issue rules, to protect consumers from pollution, to stop ripoffs, to protect privacy, do whatever. And now corporations get to have this special process to get those rules undone. They do that by leveraging all these asymmetrical features of the CRA.
Thank you, Rob. So well stated. Before we get to the second round of questions, I just wanted to see if Tom or James wanted to comment, or Rob, if you wanted to comment on anything else that was discussed so far.
I would
go ahead, Tom.
I would just add to what Rob said. It's corporations, all right, and they're the primary user of the CRA, but it can be ideological groups as well. One of the James mentioned how kind of arbitrary it is. One of the rules that got overturned from the Obama administration was a rule that protected wolf pups and bear cubs from getting gassed in their dens on public lands, and that why that turned up? Well, there was an ideological group that wanted to kill wolves and bears. So it can be and it usually is corporations, but it can be odd ideological groups too making use of this.
James?
Yeah, and just to underscore Rob's point about how this is effectively a tool for corporate-driven deregulation. 8 years ago, we tracked the individual sponsors of the CRA resolutions, and lo and behold, to the surprise of no one, they had a lot of financial support for their campaigns from the very industries that benefited from these CRA resolutions. Of course, I'm not suggesting that there's a quid pro quo here, but it does facilitate that kind of problematic relationship. Just creating the appearance of impropriety, even if there's not the reality. And that's something we're going to look toward in the months ahead. Is what are the resolutions that are getting introduced, and what are the financial relationships between the sponsors and the industries that benefit from them?
Great points. Now I want to go back to Tom, back to some of the nitty gritty. What kind of agency actions are eligible for repeal by the CRA?
Well, it's a really broad group of agency actions. It applies to rules as defined in the Administrative Procedure Act. And a rule under the Administrative Procedure Act is an agency statement of general or particular effect and general or particular applicability and future effect. And so that's more than just the big major rules that get promulgated that have $100 million impact on the economy. Those have a separate little treatment under the Congressional Review Act. But this technically applies to guidance documents, to interpretative rules that just say this is how we interpret things, to a whole lot of agency actions. And these all have to be referred to Congress. Well, the agencies don't refer all of them to Congress. And uh, so far, that's sort of been a bone of contention with some folks on the right who say, well, we should be able to challenge any rule that has not been submitted to Congress at any time. So the bottom line is it applies to a wide variety of agency actions. There are some exceptions for things like agency rules of procedure and organization and some forward-looking rate making, but they're minor exceptions.
Thank you. James, okay. Now I want to go to the question that I think folks think is the most inscrutable, and that is the look back period. Can you explain what it is, how it's calculated, why it's significant as we head into this next administration?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, the big Achilles heel of the CRA is that presidents have to sign it, right? And presidents are not going to sign regulations that their own agencies issued. But under the CRA, it basically guarantees Congress a set period, 60 working days in Congress, essentially, to review rules. So the question arises, what happens if a rule is issued so late in a Congress that Congress doesn't get the full 60 days because they adjourn before the time is up? CRA, like Elizabeth Warren, has a plan for that. What it basically does is it picks up the rule review period, that 60 days, and magically transports it into the future, into the next Congress, where that 60 working day period starts over again on January 15th, I think. And so the next Congress gets a second bite at the apple. And, this happens routinely, right? Lots of rules are issued towards the end of the year. Like Professor McGarity mentioned, though, this is significant when you have a change in presidential administration. So you have a different president who may or may not be inclined to sign a resolution of disapproval. And that president's party also happens to control both chambers of Congress. This is what we call the stars aligning. And maybe that's not a great way to put it because that implies it doesn't happen often. But in point of fact, it actually happens a lot. So we saw this at the end of the Clinton administration. We saw this at the end of the George W. Bush administration, Obama administration, the first Trump administration, and now the Biden administration. So you're seeing a pattern there. That's basically the million or billion dollar question right now is what are the 60 legislative working days? When does that period begin? When does that look back period begin in the current Congress? Because that will delineate the universe of rules that are eligible for review in the next Congress and eligible for potential rescission by the Republican-controlled Congress and President Trump.
James, can you explain why we don't have a date certain, why there's ambiguity about what that date is?
Yeah, so the challenge is, like I said, you have to give Congress their 60 working days to consider this stuff. And the only way we know when that is when Congress finally adjourns at the end of the year. And none of us has a crystal ball. We can't predict when that's going to happen, how many days Congress is going to add to their workflow, how many days they're going to take away. So the bottom line is we just will not know for certain how far the look back period stretches until Congress finally adjourns later this month. And by then we'll know. We have a pretty good guess based upon history, based upon what the current calendar looks like, but that's just a guess.
What is our best guess right now?
What I think what I saw was September 1st, but I think that was the last best guess from like a month ago, and I think that's already like outdated. So I'll say any time between September 1st and September 15th is probably not a bad guess.
Okay, Rob. So let's get to what rules are at risk in this ambiguous look back period.
Yeah, well, I just threw in the chat the same link that Brian had put in earlier, which is a list that we've compiled of rules that may be subject to CRA. I think we're using an August 1 date for this calculation. And as James said, we'll know when we know what the actual cutoff date is. So there's 50 plus rules that would be subject to CRA review if August 1 is the date. There are about an equal number, maybe slightly more, of rules that are pending that actually still could get done before the transition and then become subject to CRA. There are about 10 that are under review or have been completed a review at OIRA, the office inside the Office of Management and Budget that does regulatory review, that seem to be done and are probably likely poised to be issued finally in the next few weeks. So we're looking at a range of 50 to 60 plus. And if you're worried about your own specific rule, just click on our tracker, because I'm not going to read the 50 or 60 there. They include some rules that probably are not super controversial and not likely to be subject to CRA, although you never really know. And it could be that there's some individual interest or even an individual senator who cares about that rule and they drive forward a CRA on it. But for example, there's some rules that are updating FOIA standards at different agencies. There's some rules about adopting building codes that are probably not super controversial because they're established externally anyway. But there are a lot of things that are controversial, and I'll list a few in a second. So the CRA makes it easy for Congress and specifically the Senate to move these resolutions of disapproval. There is still some time constraint in terms of managing the Senate floor time. So, we saw whatever it was, 16 or something done at in the first Trump administration. And it's unlikely, although not impossible, that they could go much higher than that, given the other things that they're going to do with their floor time. So out of those 50, if you guess that maybe 15 seems to be not very controversial and you think 35 are kind of in the zone of controversy, maybe half are going to be attacked. But we don't really know. It'll just be driven. Again, it relates, coming back to this narrative, it'll be driven by the interests that are seeking to benefit themselves. So whichever corporations have the most leverage, combined with the particular interest of legislators, will determine what the priorities are and what they go after. Among the things that are on our list, these are not secret. We're not giving anything away as a target list to anybody. This is published stuff, and I can assure you the regulated industry knows when they're being regulated. So don't worry that we're giving away family secrets here. But among the things on the list are an FDIC rule on fair hiring, a Health and Human Services rule on tobacco sales, EPA rules on major sources under the Clean Air Act, on lead in drinking water, on methane emissions, on dust, lead hazard standards, a variety of standards from the Consumer Product Safety Commission, which may or may not be controversial. People like Rachel, who wants and maybe still works on these things, will know whether they're really controversial. I don't. But for example, there's a safety standard for nursing pillows. That's not the biggest issue in the world. But if there's an industry that's affected, they may be going after it. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has done a few things, including recently to protect personal financial data. That's a highly consequential rule. And we'll see whether it's targeted or not. So that's it. That's a sampling. The full list is available on that tracker there. As we're thinking about this again politically, because at the end of the day, that's what really matters. The degree to which, if a rule that you focus on is potentially subject to attack, you don't have all the power in the world to stop it because they can steamroll this through under the Congressional Review Act. But two things. One, if we make it controversial, they're less likely to do it. So it's really important to speak up about this and explain why the rule that you're focused on is really popular. And it's popular not just because it's pretty, but because it does important things for people. It's a common sense protection, and that undoing it would be done only for one reason, which is to serve specific corporate interests at the expense of regular people. And the other thing is, if we're going to lose these things, we don't want to go quietly. It's really important that we carry the narrative forward in the individual fights, and most especially in the meta fight, because it's going to happen for a dozen and a half rules, that we tell this story. Not so much focusing on the specifics of this process, which are flawed, as we've discussed, but whatever, that's not an important thing for the American people. What is important is that special rules are being hijacked by corporations to undo public protections that are popular, necessary, protect us from poisons, protect the safety of our products, prevent us from getting ripped off, protect our privacy. Corporations don't like that, and they're using this new administration to override these popular rules, popular, progressive, important rules, at the expense of us and for narrow corporate interests.
Thanks, Rob. Wanted to give everyone an opportunity to comment on things that were said in this second round before we get to the third.
I would just add one slight thing, and that is the last round during the Trump administration, there was some effort to combine a bunch of rules into a single joint resolution. And I wouldn't be surprised to see that happen again, just a wipeout kind of joint resolution. Whether that's legitimate under the statute is a matter, obviously, it's a debatable matter. But in fact, you can't get judicial review, so the debate would be pretty much in Congress.
James, do you want to respond to that? Because there actually was legislation that would compile those things.
Yeah, I mean, there's something called the, oh God, I hate to even use the phrase, the Midnight Rules Relief Act, that proposes to allow Congress to roll up a bunch of these into a single resolution, which suggests that Congress recognizes that you have to go one by one. But, like Tom said, there's no judicial review. So if Congress does it without the Midnight Rules Relief Act, it's not entirely clear what one could do to stop them. And that's, one of the many problematic features of the CRA.
It's possible you could go to the parliamentarian or something like that, but that's
right. And that's one of the numerous bills that CSS and other groups have opposed for making this shortcutting process even more problematic and efficient in a way that increases the asymmetry. Okay, on to round three. So, Rob, I think you did a really great job, along with Tom and James, in discussing why the CRA is so controversial and problematic. You also talked in a really articulate way about why it's so important for organizations who care about particular rules to be loud, to articulate the reasons why the law is so important and the process is so problematic. But what would you say, given how flawed and ambiguous and complicated this law is, what are our suggestions for reform? And are any of those suggestions viable in the short or long term?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of main approaches. The easiest one would just be to get rid of it. It's a bad law. It can be used for some good. I favor using it when it's possible for positive purposes, as long as it exists. But for what we've discussed, it's asymmetrical. It is a pro-deregulatory, pro-corporate bill, and we'd be better off if it were wiped off the books. So my preferred solution is get rid of it. It's also possible to tweak it to limit the harm it does. One proposal that was included in the Stop Corporate Capture Act that we in the Coalition for Sensible Safeguards and many others on this call have supported would get rid of this provision that we haven't talked about too much, dealing with substantially the same issue. So there's some extent, again, fuzzy around the edges, some extent to which passing a CRA resolution prevents the agency that issued a rule in the first place from issuing the same rule in the future. How much they have to change it in the future is an important topic, but it has some impact, and it definitely has a major chilling impact. We know agencies are reluctant to go back to spaces where Congress has passed a resolution. If you got rid of that provision, it would make it possible for agencies to do their job. Okay, Congress didn't like it. The agency wouldn't just tee it up again, but in the future, after some time had passed, they wouldn't be prohibited or even chilled from working in the same space. So I think that's the primary sort of mitigating proposal that's been made and that's live. How viable are these things? Well, they're not going to be viable in this Congress that's about to use the CRA for all the devious purposes we've described. I think they're totally viable in a future Congress that's reconstituted and with a different president. But we're a little ways away from that. Last thing I'd say before kicking it back to you, Rachel, is I think it's important for us to keep this stuff in mind. That that's the long term. I don't think talking about the CRA as a structure publicly is a great strategy for us. I just think it's a mistake to get focused on really obscure and confusing process issues. Much better to talk about what is being done. And just repeat myself for the 8th time, simple story. Corporations are hijacking process to roll back rules that protect us all to benefit themselves. That's a story I think we should be telling in individual cases and in the meta story. And keeping these reforms in mind, hopefully we get there, but it ain't coming soon.
I appreciate it. I wanted to infuse a dire conversation with a bit of optimism, which is why I wanted to put that in there and to give a sense of what folks are thinking about since we talk so much about how problematic this law is, but definitely agree with your frame and suggestions for big picture. James, how frequently has the CRA been used to repeal agency actions?
It's the history of the CRA is really interesting. So like I said, the stars have aligned a lot, right? There was a lot of opportunities to use it early after its passage. And it was used once very early. The George W. Bush administration famously or infamously repealed a really important OSHA rule on ergonomics, which is still today the leading cause of workplace injury, like not even close. OSHA had spent years on this standard, lots of resources, and it was going to help a lot of people. But it got wiped off the books in a matter of weeks. And just to illustrate how powerful that salty earth provision is, OSHA has not gone back in the nearly 25 years since, right, and touched any aspect of ergonomics, let alone the general standard, right? They're even afraid to gather basic data about ergonomics injuries. That's just how toxic the fallout is from these CRA resolutions. And I think that was sort of the sense, right, of the CRA for much of its early history, was that it was this kind of atomic bomb, legislatively speaking, that should be used in a very reserved, hesitant manner, right? I vividly remember there being some discussion early in the, during the Obama transition, were we going to use this thing? The stars have aligned for us. And that was one of the discussions that came up with, it's just too powerful a weapon to use for things that we, only sort of dislike. Those guardrails quickly came off with the Trump administration, right? Just unprecedented use of this weapon, and just sort of consistent with the Trump administration's general ethos of tearing things down and not worrying about consequences. So right out of the gate, they repealed 14 rules in short succession. and then later on, there was a CFPB rule, so issued basically by a legacy Democratic agency, right, early in the Trump administration, and so they repealed that rule, and then later on, still there was a rule, a guidance from the CFPB that was, through technical means was made eligible for repeal, so they repealed that. So 16 in all, and then going forward to the Biden administration, they ended up repealing 3 out of 5 or 6 that were under consideration. And this was significant, right? This is the first time a Democratic presidency had ever actually used the CRA. And I know that was controversial. There was a lot of debate about whether, even with the policy gains that could be achieved through its use, whether it was worth giving this clearly asymmetric law, that kind of bipartisan legitimacy, right? At the end of the day, we decided that it was, or folks decided that there was no sense in unilaterally disarming, especially since there was no hope that this CRA would ever get repealed. So here we are. And now it's your guess as good as mine. It's how many times it's going to be used in the months ahead. Around a dozen is probably not a bad guess, though.
Thanks, James. I wanted to go to you, Tom, and I want to combine a question that we discussed before. How does the CRA's substantially the same provision work, with a question from the audience that their understanding is that there's no clear definition of what substantially the same actually means. So could you first sort of put that in context? We talked about it a bit, but it's incredibly important. So how does the substantially the same provision work? And to the extent that it is at all, how is it defined?
Well, it's as the questioner pointed out, it's a very vague term, and it really hasn't been defined, other than by basically the in terrorem effect of the provision, that agencies stay away from it. Now, here's, I think, a very interesting legal question that could well wind up being resolved by a court. The agency, the Trump administration, CRAs a number of rules. We have the next administration, a Democratic administration, and the agency promulgates a rule along the same lines. Somebody challenges it under the CRA and says, no, you can't promulgate that rule because it's substantially the same. Is that going to be subject to judicial review? The CRA says that there shouldn't be any judicial review of any determination, finding, or action. But this wouldn't be an action taken under the CRA. This would be an action by an agency challengeable under the CRA. So my guess is that a court would take on the question and then would get a definition of what's substantially the same. I don't know of another forum in which that can be determined definitively. One could imagine a future Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs and OMB making that determination and having fights within a Democratic administration about whether a regulation is substantially the same. And I suppose it's even possible that some entity, maybe an executive order, could provide more grist on this bone of what does it mean to be substantially the same. At this point, though, I can't tell you. I think it's going to be one of those things like you know it when you see it.
James or Rob, do you want to add anything to this?
I'll add one thing to that. I agree with everything that Tom said, of course. I think this is what we say now will matter for what happens 4 years from now. So I think it's important that we recognize there is no real definition of substantially the same, and we don't overpower it so that future regulatory agencies feel more chilled and constrained than they should. James is exactly right. At OSHA, after the first CRA, they won't touch the issue of ergonomics. That's definitely not what CRA suggests should be the case, but it's been the political case. So I think we want to try to prevent that from happening. So a couple of things. One, when folks talk about this, a lot of times the language gets a little bit lost, and it's people say the future agency can't do anything that's substantially similar or just similar, and that's not the statutory language. Substantially the same is definitely more narrow than similar. So we should be clear about that and not say it prevents the agency from doing anything in the space in the future. Two is obviously, I mean, I think the obscenity reference is probably right because it's almost impossible to imagine a definition that would apply in all cases. You can't quantify how much a rule is different than a prior rule in all cases. It doesn't work across rules. It's not how they are. So you'd have to look at it. But I think we want to make the case that substantially the same is bad, but it's narrow. It means the same, or at least substantially the same. And consequential changes, but that still do something that's roughly similar, are fine even in the zone, even after a CRA resolution is passed. Again, I don't think we want to spend a ton of time talking about this now because it's not going to matter, at least for 4 more years.
Right.
But I do think when we went through this in the first Trump administration, I think some of us, because we wanted to make the case about how horrible this was, we kind of overstated the lasting impacts. And I think that's a mistake because overstating lasting impacts now actually may be a self-fulfilling prophecy that prevents agencies from taking up this stuff in the future. And I think without getting into too many details, we saw that a little bit. We saw some agencies that actually did want to go back, but were and revisit rules that have been CRA'd, but were more cautious. They have to be cautious because that's what this law requires, but maybe more cautious than they should have been, in part because of the kind of languaging that some of us had done in the past. So I think we want to be more careful about that. This thing is bad enough. They're going to do bad things for bad people for bad reasons, and we can tell that story without saying it's for here and ever after.
Thanks, Rob.
And just to build on Rob's case for like optimism, 2 rules that the Trump administration repealed did get reissued ultimately. And reasonable minds can debate how different they were practically speaking, but I mean, we're not drawing on an empty slate here. Rules have been reissued. The really drastic response of OSHA to the ergonomics rule should no longer be seen as like the paradigm, right? Something like the SEC rule that was reissued, or the I forget what the other agency rule was, but it was basically a drug testing rule, right? It wasn't strong enough, so they repealed it, and then were like, oops, we wanted a strong rule after all, so they went back and reissued it.
Thank you. So I wanted to go to some of our other questions, either from, well, it will be a combination from the Q&A bots and from the previous questions, but a number of questions ask what we've been hearing, whether Republicans have said anything publicly about their CRA plans. Is there intel on that? Do the other things that Congress has to do initially impact that? Given like the 60 days, session days that Congress will have. So have folks been hearing about that in the realm of deregulatory efforts that we've heard? Have you heard anything specific about CRAs?
I mean, I haven't heard anything specific. I've heard a lot of general, like, oh, we're going to use the CRA aggressively. And I think it's even in Project 2025, actually, they call on Congress to use it aggressively. And that's, sort of one of the things about the CRA is it allows, these really ineffective, unproductive Congresses to create the appearance that they're being effective and productive. Like, I mean, no joke. A significant proportion of the legislation that Congress actually passed during the first 2 years of the first Trump administration were CRA resolutions, right? So, I mean, of course, they're going to talk about this stuff very generally, like we're going to do all these resolutions because we're going to deliver for our constituents or blah, 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 blah. But yeah, I mean, I have a hard time believing they're going to get specific until next year. But certainly expect a lot of like overblown rhetoric about how aggressive they're going to be with it.
My guess is the lobbying is going on right now as to the folks that really want it, who feel really are hurt by particular rules, are finding their supporters, their the people that are going to go forward with this as we speak.
Yeah, I'm sure that is likely occurring. There's a bunch of questions which really, I think, go to a frame that Rob has been reiterating about how the community of folks who cares about particular rules can be organized, empowered, given, where all these folks will be in this CRA context. Obviously, what we're doing right now is a way to try to educate folks, to help prepare folks, but really wanted to get all of your thoughts, and really starting with Rob, about how we build solidarity among advocates who are working as much as we can to ensure that these rules protect the public interest and remain in effect.
The short answer is through the Coalition for Sensible Safeguards. Did I get that one right?
Yeah.
Totally. A+.
Yeah, so I mean, actually, I think that's it. Like, we have this list. If you're not on the list, you probably are. It's probably how you saw this. Make sure you're on the Good Regs list. Someone should throw that up in the chat to how to sign up. We're going to be sharing information. Everybody should be sharing information as they're getting it in your specific area. And then we'll have meta stuff through CSS, Public Citizen. We'll have our own stuff too. Here, our tracker will keep going. I know there's a question about that. When the time closes, we'll be able to be more precise about where the cutoff is and what's in and what's out, obviously. So we'll have that available. We'll make that available in real time as quickly as possible. It's not exactly real time, but it'll make it as quickly as possible. We're definitely be pushing out narratives as it's happened in advance, to talking points to share, and then as it's happening. And I think that the trick for all of us is to do the two things at once. If you're focused on your particular rule at the EPA or OSHA or CPSC or Nuclear Regulatory Commission or wherever it is, do that work, make the case. You know better than anybody else why that rule is important and why it should stay on the books and who's going after it and why. Make that case, make it as a political, popular case. Don't just get caught up in the weeds on the technical stuff. And then let's, to the extent you can, connect it to the meta narrative. It's not just this one, they're doing it across the board for these corporate backers. And then those of us who are focusing simultaneously on specific rules, but also on the meta project, that's our job too, collectively, to push that narrative forward. At the start of the Trump administration, a lot of stuff's going to happen. A lot of really bad, horrible things are going to happen. This is not trivial, though. This will get attention. And we have the capacity to collectively to really importantly shape a narrative about what they're doing and why. And I think that's we should stop the ones where we can. I think there's a question. I'm sorry, one last thing. I think one question points this out. The Republican majority in the Senate is not that narrow. And the House, it's incredibly narrow. So if we can pull off a couple Republicans from supporting a CRA, they're not going to be able to push it through in the House. So in some cases, that may be possible, depending on what the rule is and how things cut. So absolutely, let's try to stop these things from happening. And along with that, let's make sure we're just telling this narrative and working together collectively, sharing information, throwing it in solidarity where we can on specific rules, but also doing the collective thing, which we all can and should do, of telling the story, both to protect what we can and to help shape how the rest of this administration unfolds to the extent we can have influence, which is more than it sometimes feels like.
Thanks, Rob. James, do you want to speak to this too?
Yeah, I just want to underscore Rob's point about the House. Like the without getting into technical details, the CRA doesn't pay much attention to the House. I mean, just the thinking there is that if you have a majority, that's good enough. But it's razor thin in the House. and historically, if you wanted to block a CRA, like the Senate was the forum. I don't think that's the case next year. The key battleground will be the House, because if you can peel off 2 votes, like that's the ball game right there. So definitely think about who your champions on these issues are on the other side of the aisle. Make sure you don't have squishy Dems who might vote the wrong way. Just standard advocacy type stuff.
And James and I, in particular, have spoken to a number of coalitions who are focused on this. We are happy through CSS, CPR, PC, other organizations to talk to your organization. If you know or you fear something, we can talk you through the process, talk to you about how to fight it, connect you with other folks. But I think the key thing is you all know how to do this. You all know how to push for particular regulations. That's why these regulations exist, because of your hard work. So it's really applying the same work that you all do incredibly well in this context. So we could give you the tools, tell you the details so you know the exact dates, but really this is what you all do well now. Someone asked, so going from meta to granular for a moment, someone asked if we could again walk through the process next Congress in more detail. Some timelines, under look back, when does the 60-day session clock start for Senate floor action? Can you, maybe I'll go to James first, go super granular about when the clock, or as the magic carpet shifts, as you have well explained, when will it start, and what will that period be?
Yeah, so basically, so it starts on January 15th, and it creates the legal fiction that all those rules were issued on that very day, or so that's when the clock starts ticking on all of them, right? And then again, Congress gets their 60 working days to look at these things. And again, we cannot predict what that means in calendar days in the future, right? It's just however long the House and the Senate decide to show up for work. In the first Trump administration, and so I don't think we brought this up earlier, but the expedited procedures that Tom and I sort of laid out for you, they expire. There's an expiration date on those, at least on the Senate side, right? And that also ends with the 60 working days in the Senate. And so when does that run out? Like I said, we can't predict that in the future. Going back to the first Trump administration, my recollection is that it was like mid-May, maybe even early June was when that finally expired. And so once those are gone, the CRA is basically a dead letter, right? I mean, you can still pass CRA resolutions, you just don't, or you can still introduce CRA resolutions, you just don't get the benefit of you know, the limit of 10 hours on debate in the Senate, or the procedures for moving things out of committee on a minority vote. So like that's the time frame you're looking at. Like maybe another way to sort of think about the advocacy is you're running out the clock until like mid-May or something to try to keep these things from passing.
Rob or Tom, do you want to?
I would just say, no, that's excellent. Running out the clock's a nice metaphor for this.
Great. Well, I want to thank you, Tom, James, and Rob, so much for really explaining the ambiguous and the inscrutable, and going both granular and big picture for this difficult law that we will be in the midst of, and will be one of the many things that we are collectively addressing and dealing with. So really appreciate this conversation to educate folks, empower folks, and we look forward to continuing to work with you and all of the critical players in the community who will be on the front lines for fighting these things and protecting the public interest. And you know, it will be a long haul, but really appreciate the insights, Tom, James, and Rob, that you added, both about the law itself and the big picture, and about how to frame these arguments as effectively as possible. Thank you all so much. Hope you all have a great rest of the day, and there will be a lot more to come on this and other issues. Thank you so much.
Thank you.